The link I'll post in the show notes is from the Philadelphia Inquirer. America, what went wrong? The crisis deepens. This is an excerpt from a book by Donald L. Bartlett and James B. Steele. Nearly 3 decades ago, readers were jolted by a sensational series of articles by Inquirer reporters Donald L. Bartlett and James B. Steele that documented how actions by Washington and Wall Street were systematically dismantling America's middle class. Supported by powerful human stories and data from government sources, America, What Went Wrong explained why most Americans were losing ground financially. The articles provoked an unprecedented public outpouring as crowds lined the streets around the Inquirer building to obtain reprints. Expanded into a best-selling book, the series figured in the 1992 presidential race as Bill Clinton waved the book at rallies and said he had been profoundly influenced by its conclusions. I think it would have worked out better for Bill if he had been profoundly influenced by a 2x4 upside his head. Now Bartlett and Steele have updated and expanded their work in a new edition showing how the destructive trends they identified in 1992 have reached crisis levels and created soaring income inequality. This excerpt from their new book, America, What Went Wrong? The Crisis Deepens, summarizes their findings and tells what must be done to restore the American dream. Working Americans who are bearing the brunt of the economic collapse from COVID-19 are in the grip of another crisis that threatens to escalate even after they return to work. Long before the coronavirus wreaked havoc on the economy, Washington and Wall Street were wreaking havoc on the economic well-being of millions of American workers with policies that produced stagnant earnings, unaffordable health care, and the prospect of an impoverished retirement. This is no accident. It's the direct result of 40 years of deliberate national policies that favor the few at the expense of the many. As a result, the middle class continues to shrink, and the income gap between those at the top and everyone else has soared to record levels. When we first wrote about the 1%ers, the wealthiest of the wealthy, their average annual income in 1992 was $464,800. By 2017, it had risen to $1.57 million, an increase of 238%. 238%. And that was just the average for those at the top. That year, a record number of individuals and families, 20,223 individuals and families, reported income of $10 million or more. Inequality begets inequality. Look at the 2017 Trump tax bill. After decades of tax cuts favoring the rich, along came the Tax Cuts and Job Acts that gave them even more. Those earning $1 million or more received an average tax cut of $64,428 a year. Middle-class taxpayers earning $50,000 to $75,000 got $840. Overall, as we calculate, the top 1% as a class will receive $500 billion in extra pocket money over the next decade. It doesn't have to be this way. There's no law that says we as a nation have to keep sending big checks to people who don't need the money instead of investing that money for the benefit of all. How do we know this? Because at other times in history, our government, urged on by the people, has stepped forward to balance the rights of all Americans and to safeguard their health and economic security so that everyone could share in the promise of the American dream. Yet, for the past 4 decades, the prevailing philosophy of those who run the country, Joe fucking Biden, has been to help the few, though they never express it that way. What they say when questions of jobs, the economy, or healthcare come up is, let the market decide what's best for America. Keep government out. And let me break in and say that this is liberals every bit as much as it is conservatives. Classic liberals are all about letting the market decide things. The word government has taken on an unsavory meaning over the past few decades, thanks in part to the original neoliberal, Ronald Reagan, who in 1968 uttered the memorable phrase, "The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help." In truth, the federal government has been a huge help to all Americans in the past by creating jobs and strengthening social stability, sparking railroad development in the 19th century, enacting Social Security in the 1930s, adopting the GI Bill in the 1940s, starting Medicare in the 1960s, and funding research that led to the Internet. Americans have greatly benefited from the foresight of previous leaders who created government programs with the specific goal of helping people. Imagine how much more severe the Great Recession of 2008 would have been without the safety nets of Social Security and Medicare. Let me break in and say that another thing the government has done is to break up big banks and monopolies. Antitrust laws that are on the books have not been enforced for a long time. The government could be doing that. When I was a kid, I was taught that monopolies were wrong and illegal. I wonder what happened since then. Back to the story. To reverse government policies and to shape new programs that will benefit all Americans will be very difficult. But our history tells us that it can be done. It's been done before. I'll break in and say that one of the reasons it's so difficult now is that the monopolists have figured out how to combat what has been done before. It won't be easy to do what's been done before because they've made lots of new barriers to that sort of activity. Back to the story. Once Congress and the White House responded to the nation's needs by enacting sweeping legislative and regulatory reforms. More often than not, they acted only after events had pushed the country to the edge of crisis, ding, 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 or beyond. Even then, opposition was intense. So it was in 1906. That was a time when Americans were routinely swindled and often died when they bought and consumed rotten meat, foods packaged in poisoned preservatives, and patent medicines spiked with narcotics. Despite fierce opposition in Congress, lawmakers passed the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 only after substantial pressure by reform-minded citizens and lawmakers. President Theodore Roosevelt described its importance. The enactment of a pure food law was a recognition of the fact that the public welfare outweighs the right to private gain and that no man may poison the people for his private profit. I wonder where that sort of thinking went. Monsanto? Nestle? Congress responded again in 1913. That was when federal revenue was derived largely from the tariff, a tax added to imported goods, which, as the House Ways and Means Committee concluded, was a system of taxation which makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. To correct the growing imbalance, Congress took up legislation calling for an income tax. Again, there was intense opposition in Washington. Some charged that the income tax was a communist plot. But once more, as a result of pressure by reform-minded citizens and politicians, Congress responded by passing the Revenue Act of 1913. Under this bill, a man will be taxed according to his ability to pay, declared Clyde H. Taverner, a Democratic congressman from Illinois. If he has a small income, he will pay a small tax, and if he has a large income, he will pay a large tax. Well, we know how our Democratic and Republican legislators feel about that sort of thing today, don't we? Congress responded again in 1933 when many Americans were struggling to survive the Great Depression. Public anger was rising over tales of wealthy citizens who peddled unsound stocks, encouraged speculation with borrowed money, and cut special stock deals for their friends. After years of pressure by reform-minded citizens and lawmakers, Congress passed the Securities Act of 1933. President Franklin D. Roosevelt described its importance. The act is thus intended to correct some of the evils which have been so glaringly revealed in the private exploitation of the public's money. This law and its effective administration are steps to restore some old-fashioned standards of rectitude. Without such an ethical foundation, economic well-being cannot be achieved. Throughout American history, whenever excesses within the economy resulted in private gain for the few and hardships for the many, Congress and the White House responded, usually after interminable delays, but they responded. Until the 1980s. For the past 40 years, the two branches of government have been in legislative gridlock. And I'll break in and say that they like it that way. They do it that way on purpose. They provide cover for each other. Except for two relatively modest steps, enactment of a tax on upper-income taxpayers under President Bill Clinton in 1994 and adoption of Obamacare in 2010 to aid the uninsured, no significant legislation has been adopted specifically aimed to bolster American workers. And Obama's Romneycare is a weak-ass example of legislation aimed to bolster American workers. I think it was legislation aimed at appeasing American workers and keeping money in the pockets of big medical companies, medical insurance companies, and big pharma. The government rulebook has become a catalog of special interest provisions and favoritism to the rich. It will be reversed only by citizen action to bring about broad legislative programs that are designed to correct structural imbalances built into the economy over many years. And I'll break in and say citizen action in the form of general strikes and riots. I don't know if the author intended that or not. Changes like these are a starting point. Taxes. Tax rates should be raised on both the wealthiest Americans and large corporations. For individuals, the top rate should be increased from the current 37% to at least 40% for the upper 5% of taxpayers, and higher for the wealthiest Americans, those earning $1 million a year or more. You think? Capital gains income, the money derived from the sale of stocks, bonds, and other assets, should be taxed at the same rate as a working person's wages. Duh! This is one of the most lucrative tax breaks for the very wealthy, but there is no justification for taxing a worker's wages at a higher rate than a billionaire's profits from selling stocks and bonds. Some of us even think that capital gains income should be taxed at a higher rate than a worker's income. Capital gains income is putting nothing of value into the economy. Why should you not tax people who are just gambling? Russell Dobular, I hope you're listening to this. This is where we need Dwight Eisenhower again. For corporations whose tax rate was lowered to 21% in the 2017 Trump tax bill, Congress should increase the rate to 30%, why not 90%, and eliminate or drastically reduce the value of certain highly prized deductions, such as the ability to write off interest on borrowed money. Yeah, why are you allowed to write off interest on borrowed money? Again, it's just encouraging gambling. Here's another suggested change. Healthcare. Someday the U.S. will have a single-payer healthcare system in which one agency will ensure basic healthcare coverage for every American, a plan similar to Medicare, which covers everyone 65 years and older. Virtually every study of healthcare costs shows that a single-payer system would be the most efficient and least costly. Yet despite its advantages, a single-payer system isn't likely to happen anytime soon without forceful citizen pressure to overcome the power of the healthcare lobby and its misinformation campaign about how the system would work. No better example can be seen of this, dear viewers and listeners, than the commercials that were running during the primary debates. Health insurance companies and big pharma were out in force advertising against single payer. Those were some of the sickest advertisements I've ever seen. So what should be done about healthcare? And I have to say, as to what should be done, I don't think an expanded version of Romneycare is the answer. But these authors say, in the immediate future, a so-called public option plan seems to us the most politically feasible course, which is what incrementalists always say, until we ultimately adopt a single-payer system. With a public option, Congress should tackle a long list of other healthcare issues from surprise medical bills to soaring drug prices. Congress should at least authorize Medicare to negotiate with the pharmaceutical industry to obtain lower prices for prescription drugs. But if we start in with general strikes, then we don't have to worry about what's politically feasible. If we shut the whole thing down, there's not much they're going to do about it. Suddenly, what becomes politically feasible is a lot different. As regarding jobs, Labor Department data show that wage growth remains sluggish even with low unemployment. Many workers compensate by holding more than one job. That's me, I'm holding more than one job. We need to invest in infrastructure, new industries, and research to stimulate good-paying jobs. We need to raise the federal minimum wage, which hasn't been increased since 2009 and which was 35% lower in 2019 than in 1968, adjusted for inflation. All workers would benefit greatly from another national benefit, universal child care. On trade policy, the source of massive losses in manufacturing jobs for American workers, President Trump has initiated a tougher stance than any of his predecessors, but rather than targeting one country, China, and bringing on board other industrialized nations that have also suffered because of China's trade policies, he's gone it alone, and the gains he's eked out of China in the trade war so far are minimal. It would be cool if Victor Tiffany would wade in here on the comments as to how he feels about this. It's possible that some leftists actually agree with Donald Trump on some of these policies. As regarding retirement, this is one of middle-class America's gravest challenges. Pensions now cover only 2% of employed workers in the private sector. Did you hear that? Pensions now cover only 2% of employed workers in the private sector. That's why we need unions, down from nearly 30% in 1980. Most working Americans can't save enough for their retirement because they need every penny they earn to meet their basic needs. The lack of good-paying jobs for wage earners has intensified the problem. The most immediate way to help middle-class Americans would be to increase monthly Social Security payments for those who most need it. As of 2019, Social Security is the only retirement income for 40% of older Americans. Unless their monthly payment is increased, they will live their final years in poverty. As regarding student debt, as governments have reduced their share of financing public higher education, students have been forced to borrow. Nowhere is that truer than in the state of Pennsylvania. We must find ways to help the 40 million plus Americans who are burdened by life-altering indebtedness. First, we need to restore strong public oversight to the operation of this multi-billion-dollar-a-year venture. For years, this program has been operated largely by private contractors. Bean counters truly are running higher education right now. Many approaches could be used to ease the burden. One would be to make former students responsible for only the money they actually borrowed, minus interest payments and in some cases fines. Another might be total forgiveness for those most in need, or not means test it and forgive every fucking buddy. Come on! There is no doubt in our minds that a majority of Americans would support many of these actions, just as they would support efforts to enact legislation to end tax subsidies for companies that eliminate jobs in the United States and create jobs offshore, or to impose a capital gains tax on wealthy estates, or to impose an excise tax on the sales of stocks and bonds. These are just some of the reforms that would help restore balance to the system. A fresh approach. What is clear is that we need a new way of thinking and a fresh approach to rescue America's middle class. The solution isn't a modest one-time check from the U.S. Treasury, no matter how welcome any additional money might be to financially strapped Americans. At the heart of this fresh approach is a structural change in the way America forms public policy. We must face the fact that the private market alone cannot solve the problems undermining working Americans. That in fact, it is that unregulated market itself that has caused so much of the distress. The crisis of the middle class cries out for bold action by government to bolster opportunity and restore a sense of optimism and strong citizen pressure to make that happen. Nothing has driven home the need for a radical change in our approach to government more than the coronavirus crisis. Lacking any governmental oversight, the nation was totally unprepared for the logistical challenge that mitigating the pandemic would require, as shortages of masks, protective clothing, and test kits reached epidemic proportions along with the virus itself. The breakdown in healthcare was a direct result of the philosophy the U.S. has pursued for the last 40 years of taking a hands-off position on matters of the economy and the economic well-being of citizens under the mistaken notion that the market will deliver prosperity to everyone. It hasn't, and it won't. To deal with this, the solutions need to be long-term. We must first conceive and then enact new policies and then stick with them for years to come. Only then will most Americans have the economic security in place to fulfill the promise of the American dream. I'll break in here and say that again. We need to make sure that these reforms stick after we put them in place. After the Great Depression, the plutocrats came roaring back with policies to undo everything that FDR was able to do. We need to make strong garrisons against the potential wannabe plutocrats of the future. Only then will most Americans have the economic security in place to fulfill the promise of the American dream. Powerful lobbies fiercely oppose any change that would erode their privileges, and I'll break in and say that they would fiercely oppose any changes that we can make, and they would try to overturn them in the future, deploying armies of paid agents and political action committees to protect their interests. Yet the power that average citizens possess can be decisive if wielded wisely. Over the years, many Americans have written to us to offer solutions to the crisis affecting the middle class. Many displayed a clearer grasp of the problems confronting the country than the rulemakers in Washington. Now let me break in and say that the rulemakers in Washington damn well know what they're doing. It isn't that they don't have a clear grasp, it's that they have the wrong masters. We need to become their masters. And many saw reason for hope rather than despair. As one reader concluded, to the extent that federal policy, rather than impersonal economic factors, is responsible for the hardships our citizens are suffering, there is reason to hope for the better. We make these policies through our elected representatives. What we make, we can unmake. Okay, that was a good article, but I want to say that we need to stress general strikes and riots over everything else that will fix this. I keep waiting for my fellow lefty YouTubers to say, hey, we need a general strike. Hey, we need a general strike. Hey, we need a general strike. Every day, every fucking day, we need a general strike until it happens. Hey, we need to get out into the streets and protest. We need our fucking pitchforks. We need our guillotines. Every fucking day, we need to say this. Fellow YouTubers, we need to keep saying this. We need a fucking revolution, and we need each other to help make it happen.